You know what I like? That's right, 90s computers, which brings me to this thing, the Pentium MMX 233MHz, a processor that I didn't actually own until the mid-2000s because in the 90s I was too busy, being poor. This is a cool processor because it can run a huge variety of software from DOS stuff all the way up to some Windows XP stuff. So in this part of the ERIC experiment, we're gonna build an ultra-compatible and versatile computer around this processor. So let's go, let's do it, let's just do it.
So if you want your PC software to really move, make sure your PC has the Intel Pentium processor.
As mentioned in the intro, this computer will be built around the Intel Pentium MMX 233MHz, the most powerful of the original Pentium processors. Around 2004 to 2006, I had a Pentium 4 computer at home that was shared between my two siblings, my parents and I. So because I couldn't use that computer as much as I wanted, I built myself one with the same processor, and at the time it was enough to browse the web, listen to MP3s, use MSN and other stuff. I used that computer for a year or so until I upgraded to a Pentium 3. Because of that, I'm very fond of this processor and I'm really looking forward to building this computer. This is an actual screenshot taken on that old computer. Jesus, look at that goofy teenager. Anyway, let's get started with the actual build and I'll go into more details about the components chosen for it as we go. The case we're using for this build is this beautiful AT case I got from eBay. It's probably better suited for a 386 era computer, but I love the look of this thing, so I'm using it for this computer. It is branded as Microscience Computers. I couldn't find much information about it on the internet except for some newspaper ads from the late 80s and early 90s on newspapers.com and their website microscience.com.au on the Wayback Machine that has some records between 1998 and 1999. It seems like it was an Australian company based in South Melbourne. Aside from the year 2000, when the website was redirected to Netstar Marketing, the company that apparently made Microscience Computers' website, there were no records on the Wayback Machine until 2017 when the domain started redirecting to the website of another company with the same name that makes microfiltration products. Anyways, back to the computer, and first we need to prepare the case for the build. To do that, we'll remove the parts that we're not going to use, like the power supply, which we'll replace with a new one. More on that later. Then we need to remove the floppy drive because we're replacing it with one that isn't as yellow. While unscrewing it, I realized there was a screw on the other side of the caddy, so we have to remove the caddy to access it. Also, as you can see here, the internal speaker wires broke away from it, so we'll need to fix that later. I will put this aside for now alongside with its wires. Now we're gonna give the case a bit of a clean, and to make it easier, I'll remove the front panel by removing these 6 screws. And after that, let's use the vacuum cleaner and a dusting cloth to clean it. The last thing we'll do before the actual build is to remove this little metal tab so we can install our PS2 mouse connector. And that's what we're gonna do now. We're putting this thing in first because the power supply will go on top of it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we'll install this new power supply, and the reason for that is so the computer has clean, stable, and reliable power delivery. We don't know in what state that old power supply is, and I don't want to risk the components in the computer with it. After screwing it in place, it does look a bit out of place, but it's okay, it won't be visible most of the time. Now let's install the motherboard, which is an Asus PI P55T2P4. What a mouthful. This is a pretty standard AT motherboard, not a lot of mystery here. It has 3 ISA slots, 4 PCI slots, 4 EDO RAM slots, and so on. I need to install these standoffs so the motherboard doesn't touch the case, and it's held in place by a single screw, which is what this case and motherboard combination allowed me to use. It isn't great, but it works, I guess. Now we can install our trusty Pentium MMX 233MHz on the motherboard. The thermal paste I'm using is this Cooler Master one I bought from my Ryzen desktop. It is overkill for this processor, but it's what I have at the moment. After installing the cooler, let's just change these jumpers to the right configuration for this processor. After that, we can move on to our memory. We are going to install 4 32MB RAM sticks, giving the computer a total of 128MB of RAM. This is nothing in today's world, but it's plenty for this build, and it will give us a lot of flexibility to run a huge variety of software on multiple operating systems. Man, I remember when I was a kid trying to build a computer with EDO memory and not realizing that we need to have them in pairs so the computer can post, and I wouldn't for the life of me connect the dots why the computer wouldn't turn on with only one memory stick, and because of that I thought the motherboard was defective in some way and only worked intermittently. Silly me from the past. So, as you may have noticed, we are using an ATX power supply on an AT system, and of course they're not compatible with each other. To fix that, we're going to use this adapter which has a female 20-pin ATX connector on one end and the motherboard AT connector on the other. The adapter has 2 wires that we need to connect to the power switch on the front of the case. After this is done, our ATX power supply can act as an AT1. Let's screw the front of the case back on now before we have no clearance to do that anymore, and then connect the CPU cooler to the power supply. The video card we're installing on this computer now is an S3 Verge. It technically is a 3D accelerator, albeit not a very good one, but that's not an issue given what we have in mind for this computer is compatibility more than anything else. And for that reason, this is a great choice for this computer. We can definitely do some gaming on it though. The DOS games I intend on playing on this computer are gonna work without a doubt, and a lot of early Windows games as well as some lighter 3D games should work too. The sound card we're using definitely doesn't need any introduction. It is the Swiss Army knife of sound cards, the ISA Sound Blaster 16. I truly love this sound card. I've had it in many computers throughout the years, many times with speakers that didn't even have active amplification. Not only is it probably the most compatible sound card we can put in a computer, as all operating systems we're gonna throw at it should have the drivers for it built in, or at least it should be really easy to find them for download, but it also sounds amazing, especially when playing MIDI. It truly is an amazing piece of hardware, especially considering its age. For networking, we're using a generic network card based on the Realtek RTL8139 chipset. I have used this networking chipset in many computers in the past. Like the other parts shown before, it is a very compatible piece of hardware which I won't have much trouble to get working on any of the operating systems I'm intending on installing on this computer. Let's connect the PS2 port now because I forgot to do it before. I should have done that before installing the power supply because of the limited space here, and as you will see, this is gonna be a recurring theme in this build from now on. Like, for example, with the serial and parallel brackets which we are installing now. The space here is really tight and I should have removed the power supply before installing them. That would have made my life a lot easier, but oh well. And the same happened here with the other serial port. Now, the issue that I realized at this point is that I can't put this bracket in now, otherwise I won't be able to connect the USB header. So let's do that first. Now, because I'm lazy, instead of moving the video card now, I'll just pass the cable under it. Now we can put the serial and parallel bracket on and uh-oh. My laziness came back to bite me in the ass. I can't put the bracket on because the USB header is on its way. We're going to have to move some things around here, starting by the video card, which we're moving one PCI slot to the left. Now we can install the USB bracket on top of its own header and the other bracket can go next to it. Let's just remove this thing before continuing. Instead of using a conventional hard drive on this computer, we'll be using an SD card to IDE adapter I got on eBay a while back, and this is awesome because it will allow us to swap operating systems very easily. Another advantage is not having to use old mechanical hard drives which are bound to fail very soon. Now I can't put this thing where I want it because it doesn't fit on top of PCI slots or the ISA slot. So once again, I have to move a bunch of things around because the only place this thing's gonna fit is next to the IDE headers. Now we have the space for it, but before screwing it in place, I'll connect the Molex to floppy adapter and the IDE cable to it so I don't have to fiddle with it when it's installed in that corner. Once again though, we need to unscrew these brackets because the wires are on my way. After doing that, we have the space to install the SD adapter and I can screw the other brackets in place. Hopefully I don't have to mess around with those brackets anymore. After connecting the SD to IDE adapter to the header on the motherboard and to the power supply, we can move on to our removable storage devices. I thought about starting with the CD-ROM drive, but doing that would make it harder to install the Gotek floppy disk emulator, which is going under it. So after taking a quick detour to connect the CD-ROM audio cable to the sound card, I went on to install the floppy emulator. I just needed to remove the 3.5-inch bay cover before doing that. Installing this is exactly the same as installing a conventional 3.5-inch floppy drive, and that's what the computer is going to see it as. After loading floppy disk images to a USB flash drive, we can cycle through them by pressing the buttons at the front, and the computer is going to think that they're actual floppy disks. The emulator is made by a company called Gotek, and it's really easy to find on eBay. I will admit that it spoils the look of the computer a bit, but it is a very convenient piece of hardware to have. Now that we connected the ribbon cable to the emulator, we can install our CD-ROM drive. That's pretty standard stuff, there isn't much to be said about it. After connecting the CD drive to the motherboard, we have to screw that caddy back in place so we can install a real floppy drive. The internal speaker was fixed off camera by resoldering the wires back to it. Now we can install a floppy drive. You might be wondering why I'm installing it since we already have the emulator, and I have two reasons for that. The first one, which is the silly one, is that I want to have the floppy seek noise when the computer starts. The second reason is that, even though it's going to be rare, I want to have the ability to read or write real floppy disks in case I need to. And here we hit another snag, the ribbon cable doesn't reach the drive. To solve this issue, we'll have to swap the emulator and the floppy drive, which kinda sucks because I wanted to have the real floppy drive where it's supposed to go. But that works because the header on the floppy drive is closer to the right compared to the emulator. I also found a ribbon cable that was a few millimeters longer than the one that I was originally using, which makes things a bit easier here. Now we just have to connect the front panel LEDs and switches to the motherboard, and that should be it. We can now turn the computer on and see if it's working. For real though, I did check if the computer posted a few times while I was building it, but now I just need to check if it boots into an operating system. I already had an SD card with DOS 6.22 and Windows 3.11 installed. Windows won't start here because it's trying to load the drivers for a different video card, but this is enough to see that the computer does indeed boot. After doing a bit more testing by installing other operating systems to see if everything was okay, I found an issue. I installed Connectiva Linux 4.0, which is a Linux distro from 1999 that I really wanted to play with when I was younger but could never get fully working on any of my computers, and I was having a lot of graphical issues when loading KDE. Now, I don't know if it's a hardware defect or if it's a driver issue, but I'll replace the S3 Verge with the Matrox Millennium 2 to see if it works. The Millennium 2 is a video card that should give me the same level of compatibility I would have with the S3 Verge, so swapping it is not that big a deal. I thought I would have to change some configuration or even worse, reinstall the OS, but it was just a matter of installing the video card, booting the computer, and it worked. I have no graphical issues anymore. Now we can close this guy up by putting the lid back on and screwing these 3 screws at the back. After that, we can set up the computer on the desk so we can see what it can do. This is Full Throttle running on DOS 622. To me, this is one of the best games of all time. I grew up playing it and I finished it multiple times. I have also gotten the remastered version when it came out, and I highly recommend it if you want to experience this game on a modern computer. But there's nothing like playing it on a DOS computer. Maybe it's the nostalgia speaking, but I do prefer the pixelated DOS graphics for this game. That's not all though. With this computer I can play many other DOS games I love, like Lemmings for example. This is a lot of my childhood right here. I remember this laptop with a broken hard drive that my uncle gave to me. It was probably a 386 or something. I would boot it with a DOS boot disk and play Lemmings, Battle Chess, and Indianapolis 500 amongst other games. As mentioned earlier, this is all running off an SD card with DOS 622 and Windows for Workgroups 3.11. So DOS games aren't the only thing we can do here. If we go on Windows, we can do a lot more stuff, like for example play Sim Tower, which is definitely one of my favorite games of all time with the ones that I mentioned earlier. I can also do non-gaming related stuff, such as installing Netscape Communicator 4.07 and go on old websites with theoldnet.com. Or even go on Twitter with the client for old browsers that I'm kinda building. More on that another time. The possibilities here are endless. Installing DOS and Windows was a breeze with the floppy disk emulator. It was just a matter of writing the images to a flash drive, and then when installing it on this PC, I just had to press a button to swap the floppies. It is that easy. Windows 3.11 is one of my favorite pieces of software of all time. I particularly remember this time I messed up the Windows 98 installation I had on my computer, and because I couldn't do backups off my hard drive at the time, I patched DOS 7 and installed Windows 3.11 on it. That was my setup for a few months, and since it was around 2002, that wasn't a big deal. I could still do most of the things I wanted, like browsing the web, listening to music, chatting on IRC, and so on, until I could be bothered enough to fix the computer. Anyway, these are actual screenshots from that very setup. Yes, it is Windows 3.11 with a taskbar. At that time, there were groups of Windows 3.x enthusiasts, and it was very common to use a piece of software called Chimera to make Windows 3.x look like Windows 95. Now, you saw me accessing the internet with Netscape there, and that's possible because of the network card we added, but also I'm using this very handy Wi-Fi to Ethernet bridge so I don't have to run a cable across the room. Setting it up is as easy as powering it up, connecting it to my Wi-Fi network, and then after that plugging it to the back of the computer. At that point, the computer will get an IP address from the network normally, and I can do internet browsing as well as connecting to my NAS via FTP, where all my retro software backups are stored. That way I can transfer stuff to the computer in a very convenient way. It's so great to be able to connect to my modern hardware with modern software with this old computer. It makes my life so much easier. So DOS and Windows 3.11 are the main software combo I'm gonna be running on this computer because it's my favorite, but as you may have noticed, this computer is a bit overkill for that. That's when the convenience of the SD to IDE adapter comes in. With a simple SD card swap, we can run Windows 95, which can be used to run some early 32-bit era software, or Windows 98 for later software. I also have an SD card with Windows Me installed on it. I actually like it a lot despite the bad rep it gets. In terms of 9X era gaming, this computer will be more focused on 2D games because the video card on it, despite technically being a 3D accelerator, is not a very powerful one. So I'm probably gonna run only games like Warcraft 2 Battle.net Edition, which is one of the few games with a medieval/fantasy theme that I like, and SimCity 2000 for Windows 95, which is a game that needs no introduction. I can technically run newer games like SimCity 3000 and The Sims, but as you can see here, the computer struggles a bit with them. I do plan on building another more powerful computer to be able to run those games better, as well as heavier Windows 98 era 3D games with proper 3D acceleration, but that's the subject for another video. For now, we'll stick with lighter games. We're not limited to Windows only on this computer though, so why not installing some old Linux distros like Connectiva Linux versions 3.0 and 4.0. These are late 90s distros I got with those computer magazines that came with a CD-ROM, and being a Windows user, I remember being extremely curious to give them a go after seeing KDE screenshots in the magazines, but I was never able to get them working properly on the computers I had at the time. This computer can run them very easily though, I had no issues installing and running them. Another distro I had always been really curious about was Corel Linux, and the reason for that was that I knew Corel for their graphics software Corel Draw. So when they released a Linux distro, you can be sure I was really curious about it. I have used many other more modern Linux distros on and off over the years, but those ones specifically have always had that lure, that feeling of mystery and curiosity that I can easily satisfy with this computer. I'm mostly a Windows user, but I have always been interested in alternatives to it. Another OS that I learned about in late 90s and early 2000s computer magazines and has always intrigued me is BOS. It's supposed to be a multimedia powerhouse and it has such a curious and interesting UI even for today. This one isn't a big mystery for me though, as I had the opportunity to play with it over the years. Another operating system that I really wanted to run on this computer was IBM OS 2, especially versions 3 and 4, but sadly I couldn't install them. They really didn't like the SD to IDE adapter and would always fail while trying to copy the files. I'll try to revisit them at a later point though. Lastly, aside from Windows NT 4 and Windows 2000, which I also have SD cards for, this computer can definitely run Windows XP as I briefly mentioned earlier. It's not super fast, but it's surprisingly responsive, and that's probably because we're working with 128 megabytes of RAM here. That doesn't seem like a big deal now, as Windows XP is 19 years old at this point, but when it was the latest and greatest operating system from Microsoft, running it on a Pentium 233 MMX, or even worse on a Pentium 133 MHz with 32 megabytes of RAM as it did once, was a big deal. I mean, at least for me, but that's a story for another day.
Hi. What an incredible view.
Oh, this. It's home.
And there you have it! There are many aspects of this computer that makes it very convenient, like the Gotek floppy disk emulator and the Wi-Fi to Ethernet bridge. But I think the main one for me is the SD to IDE adapter. It certainly makes things a lot easier, especially if we want to swap operating systems quickly. We don't have to mess around with dual boot and boot menus, especially because those would have a limit on how many operating systems we'd be able to install. One last thing I did was to print these labels for the SD cards on A4 sticker paper so I can easily identify them, and I can keep them stored in this handy dandy SD card case. It was definitely fun to build this computer and revisit a lot of the software we did in this video. There are a lot more things I could show and stories I could tell, but I don't want this video to be hours long. So we will definitely revisit this computer and other pieces of hardware and software in the future, as well as retro video game consoles and other stuff I find interesting. So if you liked this video and want to see more stuff like this in the future, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss new parts of this experiment. Thanks for watching.